China and the West. So as we all know, China's been in the news a lot lately, especially in Western media. And people in the West do not have a favorable view of China. So the Pew Research Center did a study on this. They interviewed people from 14 different countries to see what their opinion was on China. So let's dive in. What did they find? So first, some key terms. First, representative sampling, which is a sample from a group that accurately represents the characteristics of a larger population. And concurrent criterion validity, how well a test outcome is consistent with the criterion that exists in the present. So the study found that many Western countries don't have a favorable view of China. The countries that they interviewed, which I thought was interesting as to why they chose these countries specifically, which was the US, Canada, Sweden, Denmark, UK, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Japan, Australia, and South Korea. Interesting to note that these are some of the richest countries in the world, and they are all liberal democracies, part of the Western Bloc. And so the article was focused on China overall, but specifically their response and handling of COVID-19. So, as you may imagine, most of those countries, well, all of those countries, had a negative assessment of China's COVID response. As you can see here, 64% of people in the US didn't agree with it, 72% in Denmark, and up to 79% in South Korea and Japan. So the only country that had a worse approval for how they handled COVID-19 was the United States, which I thought was very interesting, especially contrasting the very different outcomes of the two countries' responses. China's had around 5,000 deaths, and the US has had over 1 million. So interesting. So the two countries that these 14 countries least agreed with had the biggest contrast of deaths in their results. So we can say that these countries are hard to please because they don't want too many deaths, like in the case of the US, but they don't want to take too extreme of measures like they did in China as to eliminate those deaths. So they want a happy medium, around 500,000 deaths would be a good response. There was a correlation between people who trust President Xi Jinping and how they viewed China's response to COVID. So if you had previously already supported or approved of President Xi's policies, then you were more likely to approve of how they handled the COVID response, and then vice versa. If you didn't like Xi before, then you're not gonna like his policies. So it seems that it was less about the response to COVID and more about their already preconceived notions of China and their anti-China sentiment, which was a huge influence in how they saw things regarding the handling of the pandemic. What was done poorly? So the biggest thing in this study that I think was done poorly was, I talked about in the beginning, but representative sampling. This sampling, they chose a very specific group of countries, but these countries are not representative of the population of a whole. They just wanted these countries' opinion. These countries only constitute 930 million people in the world, less than a seventh of total people. So even if they were able to interview every single person and get a perfect sample of these countries, it still would only give us a narrow lens of how the world population views China. Next, there was no mention of any of these policies' results. They had only talked about whether or not people agreed with the policies, but it didn't talk about any of the deaths that took place in any of these countries. China has more people than all of these countries combined, and yet has had less COVID deaths than any of these countries. With 5,000 deaths, that's amazing. So the response that these countries have by having a negative view is very interesting, which leads me to my last point of what was done poorly, is that the Chinese population was the one impacted by these policies, and yet there was no mention of what they think about them. There was only a mention of what these other countries think about them, which is kind of irrelevant. We really only need to look at how China wants to view them, and the Chinese people have a very favorable view with 95% approval rating of their government, that they like these policies, and they like that there was only 5,000 deaths as compared to 1 million here in the US. What should have been done instead is they should have interviewed people from non-imperialist countries as well to get an accurate view of what they think about China and what they think about China's response to COVID. They only interviewed countries that have historically had a negative view of China, at least in the last decade or so, whereas China has allies all over the world, especially in Latin America and Africa. So if you would have interviewed people from those countries, you would have gotten totally different results, whereas every country that was surveyed here, you just got a very specific answer. You knew what was going to happen because you know how these countries feel towards China. Next, they made no mention of any of the current political landscape. Things are escalating right now to a Cold War. I mean, we're in a Cold War between these Western imperialist countries and this sort of Eastern Bloc that's forming. There was no mention of that whatsoever, and that would have taken things into context much more, instead of just saying that China's bad according to these specific 14 countries. And then last, I think they should have, it was still earlier in the pandemic, but they should have compared results from COVID policies from different countries to see who did the best at managing the spread of disease. That's a metric that's very easily measured, it's quantifiable, and we'd be able to see, who was more effective. And I think that would be a much more way at, moving forward and navigating the pandemic, to see what China's been able to do well, where they've misstepped, where we've misstepped, and that way we'd just be able to see the impact of these policies instead of just saying, well, I don't like them, or yes, I do like them. Let's actually see what comes of these policies, and then go from there. So finally, why should we care? Well, last thing people want is a war between the US and China. So we should do everything we can not to escalate to that. A huge part of that is being able to understand each other. So we don't need to adopt everything that China does here, but we also don't need to criminalize everything they do. If they want to take COVID seriously and protect their citizens from it, they should be able to do that. And they've done a remarkable job at containing the spread of COVID. Next, anti-China news coverage has led to an increase in Asian hate crimes. Asian hate crimes are at an all-time high, largely due to the negative press that China gets, especially surrounding COVID-19. So in order to decrease in that, we need to have accurate news around China that's based in their policies in order to decrease those hate crimes. And lastly, as seen in the study, the voices of the rich and powerful are heard more than the majority of voices. We only heard from people from the richest nations in the world, the imperialist nations, on what they think of China. But let's get an entire world view of it. What does Brazil think of China? What does Ethiopia think of China? This way we can have a much more accurate view of how the world views them, instead of just a specific subset of the world population. I think this will be crucial in de-escalating tensions between the US and China, and not moving towards World War III. Thank you so much.